All right, welcome this morning to our many visitors. We're glad to have you with us, and we are going to pick up our study in the book of Joshua. We are just coming up to the end of our look at chapter 18, or looking at chapter 18, because we didn't quite get that far on Wednesday, so I'm going to overlap just a little bit. We'll pick up with chapter 18 this morning, and we're going to try to get through to the end of the book by the end of Wednesday's class. All right, and in just a sec, Carl will have our slides up. But if you have your Bible handy, if you want to open up to Joshua chapter 18, the last about 3 chapters or so, what was going on in what we looked at? What were we seeing in chapters like 15, 16, 17? The distribution or the apportionment of the land of Canaan amongst the tribes. And up to this point, which tribes have a territory assigned to them? We started out with 2.5 on the east side of the Jordan while Moses was still alive, while Aaron was still alive. Which tribes were those? The first 3. Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh. After they cross the Jordan, they defeat Jericho, and they eventually defeat Ai, and they go and conquer various parts of the land. They gather, and where do they gather at? Where was their home base? Initially, they gathered where? Gilgal. And Joshua, with the aid of Eleazar, the high priest, Eleazar is who, by the way? What's his family relationship? Remember who Eleazar is? He's the son of Aaron. Yep, so Joshua and Aaron's son, the high priest, start to portion out the land. And so in 15, 16, 17, which tribes have received their territory? What was the first tribe to receive their territory? The biggest and strongest. Judah. Judah is the first tribe. And then who are the next tribes to have their inheritance assigned to them? Correct. So not a tribe, not a single tribe, I should say, belonging to one single father, but 2 tribes belonging to a single father, the 2 sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, the other half of Manasseh. And remember, we looked at, if you were here Wednesday, we looked at how Moses had told how Jacob had told his son Joseph, your sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, they're mine. Those 2 boys, those are mine. Just like Reuben and Simeon, his first 2 sons. So Ephraim and Manasseh were claimed by Jacob, by Israel, as his own. All right, and so now we are into chapter 18. And in verse 1, it says, "Then the whole congregation of the sons of Israel assembled themselves at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there, and the land was subdued before them." All right, so now they've been in the land for 4 or 5 years, probably. Some of the tribes have already settled and claimed their inheritance. But in verse 2, and I gave myself that's right. We're going to look at Shiloh first before we get to verse 2. I don't know. That's okay. All right. So the name for Shiloh is derived from the root word shala, meaning to be at rest or to be tranquil. Now, I always think that it must have been some great coincidence when you see all of these names the names of people, the names of men, the names of places. It wasn't a great coincidence, right? It looks like a coincidence to us. It really wasn't. So they are now at rest, in a manner of speaking, and the meaning of the word is traditionally meant or understood to mean he whose it is, or he to whom it belongs, referring to a figure of peace and rest. Moses had said, nope, now I'm getting confused again. Jacob had said that this will not depart from you until Shiloh comes. What is the meaning of Shiloh? Or what could we understand Shiloh to refer to? Peaceful. Could we understand Shiloh perhaps even to be pointing towards an individual? The perfect rest, the perfect peace. I think we could make an argument that we can point towards, or that the name of Shiloh can point toward the coming of Christ. There are some interesting things that happen in the next book, in the book of Judges. So we know the place of Shiloh as the place where some other things happened. It's where they set up and maintained the tabernacle until the temple was built in Jerusalem. So it was a place of pilgrimage for worship. In Shiloh is where we would read in Judges chapter 21, so we'll get to that next month, where the maids of Shiloh were captured by the Benjamites to provide them with wives. And you're probably somewhat familiar with that account. And in 1 Samuel, Samuel was brought there, consecrated to God's service in the sanctuary, and was presided over by Eli, the famous priest, and his wicked sons, right? Hophni and Phinehas. It's also where the ark would be captured later on. And that's just a few things that we are familiar with Shiloh about. This is probably not a great view, but it was the best picture I could find, just to give you a sense of what the place of Shiloh kind of looks like, or what where they believe that the tabernacle would have stood within the landscape as it looks today. And this is a panoramic view, so this is north, and then this is like 90 degrees, away, so that would be east. That's what that's pointing towards. But then they've done some excavation here in the last several years, and this is where they believe the tabernacle could have sat, where the Holy of Holies and where the holy place would be, where the brass laver would have been. It would have been facing east. And so just kind of an interesting peek at what that area looks like. So that's Shiloh. All right, so in verse 2 of chapter 18, the next thing that we read is, "And there remained among the sons of Israel 7 tribes who had not divided their inheritance." All right, so why do we have 7 tribes with no land? They've been in the land long enough, perhaps. It's been years. It's not like they just arrived. Why are there still 7 tribes with no territory? Judah got busy, claimed their territory. Ephraim and Manasseh got busy. They claimed their territory. And nobody else. They had not gone in and claimed it. And verse 3 reads, "So Joshua said to the sons of Israel, 'How long will you put off entering to take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, has given you?'" And when you look at the wording there, the word prolong, actually, he means neglect. How long will you neglect to do this thing apparently he's waiting on them. There is some level of initiative that they need to take in order to claim their inheritance. Why? Why this neglect? Why this prolonging? Why are they waiting on this? Any thoughts? They don't want to fight for it. I think that's probably the most accurate and succinct way to put it. They don't want to fight for it. And so, what does Joshua do? Well, in verses 2 through 7, we already read through verse 3, he says, starting in verse 4, "Provide for yourselves 3 men from each tribe, that I may send them, and that they may arise and walk through the land and write a description of it according to their inheritance, and they shall return it to me. And they shall divide it into 7 portions. Judah shall stay in its territory on the south, and the house of Joseph shall stay in their territory on the north." Those are the 2 that have already claimed their land. "And you shall describe the land in 7 divisions, and bring the description here to me, and I will cast lots for you here before the Lord our God. For the Levites," and he says, remember, and if you're counting, it's just 7 tribes, because the Levites are not counted, because we actually have 10 tribes that don't have a territory. But the Levites we don't count. "They have no portion among you, because the priesthood of the Lord is their inheritance. Gad and Reuben and the half-tribe of Manasseh also have received their inheritance eastward, beyond the Jordan, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave them." Then the men arose and went, and Joshua commanded those who went to describe the land, saying, "Go and walk through the land and describe it, and return to me, then I will cast lots for you here before the Lord in Shiloh." All right, so he sends these 21 men out to go through the land and survey it. Now, what do you think is the purpose of him doing that? Because if you think back, Israel doesn't have a great track record of sending people out to do things and then to return, right? Because you think back, 45 years before, you had the 12 spies. That didn't go so well. And then you had the men who Joshua sent to check out Ai, and they came back and said, "Piece of cake," right? Why is Joshua doing this? What do you think is the motive that he might have? Remember, Joshua is their leader. He has taken the place of Moses. Why is he doing this?
If they see it, they'll take ownership of it.
I think you're right. If they physically go and lay eyes on, it's going to get them thinking like, "Oh, well, that would be a really nice place over there. Wow, this is a really great territory here. Let's figure that out." And like, "Oh, look over there." If they actually go in and see it, it's going to spur them on to take this action. They're actually going to think about what their next steps should be. So really, he's trying to light a fire under them. And after class, I think on Wednesday it was, Dave Likens came up to me, and we were talking about something that we'll continue to talk about here. But, what's going on? Why would Caleb have done what he did, for instance, when he offered his daughter in return for someone to go in and take this neighboring city of Debir, right? He had already gone and captured Hebron and claimed it, but he wants someone to go and take care of Debir, and he says, "Whoever will go and capture Debir, I'll give you my daughter as a wife." I think it's the same thing. I think we're looking at two leaders, the two elders of this group of people, these Israelites, looking at a generation who are not ready to act. They're looking at a generation as they get older. I think they're kind of afraid for the future. I think what they see is this younger generation is not fit to stand up and act like men and serve God and lead and do the hard things. That's what I think. That's what I see in that. Is they are trying to teach this inexperienced younger generation how to be the next generation of leaders. Steve?
Well, I think Judges is going to prove that.
It
It's
is.
a testament to what you're saying.
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
As you keep saying that, going to Jericho, I was a piece of cake, actually, the people in Jericho, they would try to get the Israelites off their property if they were, to go in without the Lord. But when the Lord told them, they're all going to come and put their foot in the water, but they're all going to come
Right.
with them.
Right.
Then they boomerang back to what you said was absolutely correct. It's a piece of cake.
Yeah. Yeah, to the Lord, absolutely. There's something missing, though, I think, and I think you're reinforcing this point. There's something missing in the hearts of these men. And it's probably, we would boil it down and say it has to do with their faith in God or their lack of faith in God. So Joshua, as the leader, in verses 8 through 10, he sends 21 men out to survey the land. And he says, write it down, describe it in a book, bring it back to me, and then we'll figure this out. All right. So then he casts lots for them in Shiloh before the Lord. And whatever the thing is with the PowerPoint is still doing it today. It won't let me go to the next slide. There we go. All right, so back to this slide. What does Joshua do? Number one, he brings order and direction. Something that's sorely missing in this group of people. There's no order kind of coming up from. There's no grassroots. There's no. You know what? Joshua, you've shown us what to do. We can take it from here. We know how to do this. There's none of that we see. So Joshua still has to bring order and direction. What does this tell us of Joshua's character? Can we make any observations about his character? He's a long-suffering man. I think that's one.
Joshua's a leader.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, men don't take that role like they should. And I think Joshua took it very seriously. I think part of his character was he was a leader of men. And God recognized that, and that's why he was in charge of doing what he did.
Absolutely. And if you think about it in terms of a little bit bigger picture, none of the other men who were alive at that time, other than Caleb, were leaders. They were all followers. Because for their whole life, all they had done is follow. That's important. It's important to recognize who your leader is. It's important to recognize there's the pillar of smoke, there's the pillar of fire. This is the way we're going to go. There's eventually they've got the ark. We're going to follow that. But you've got this whole generation of followers. And you got two leaders.
I think what's happening here, people, and even today, we depend on God so much, which is what we should do. Don't get me wrong with what I'm saying. But it is still our responsibility to take some initiative to do something.
Absolutely.
Trusting that God will guide us. But we just can't sit back and say, okay, God, take care of me. Get me through this difficult
Yep.
time. He will, but we are responsible for doing what we need to do.
Absolutely. We saw that with Caleb, the other one who knows how to lead. He got up and said, I'm ready for my inheritance. I'm 85 years old, but I am just as ready to fight as I ever was, just as strong as I ever was. Let me have my inheritance. I'll go claim it. I will go drive out the Anakim. I will go slay those giants. I will make it mine, and I'm ready to fight for it. The other ones, I think what we see here is these other tribes, these other men, they're not willing to fight for it. So leadership attributes that we can see in Joshua is, I would say, a recognition that there's a need. Leaders always are doing an assessment and recognizing what's missing here. What do we need? All right, who's not stepping forward? What's the vacuum that needs to be filled? And then they go and fill it. And if they can do it, or when they do it well, they'll do something like Joshua did. What we don't read is Joshua didn't say, all right, come with me, here we go, we'll do it, I got this, I'll take you. He directs them, tells them what to do, and sends them out because he wants them to develop some leadership qualities themselves. Because he knows he's not going to be around a very long time further. That's what I see as leadership attributes of Joshua. And we already talked about what are some of the characteristics of the people: reluctance, followership, that kind of thing.
Well, I think in Joshua's case and elders today, in the case of Ezra, it's he prepared himself when he was young. He hung around Moses. He was in constant contact with Moses. He learned from Moses.
Yes.
Ezra said he prepared his heart
Yes?
ahead of time to lead the people. Elders have a certain standard that all Christians should have, but they prepared themselves in advance. And I think one of the things with leadership is putting forth the effort to understand what leadership requires. The children of Israel were banned in the New Testament. They were only as successful as their leadership was successful.
Yeah.
And God seemed to understand that man needs somebody to guide them, hence elders, hence the chief shepherd, hence the kings. If they had a good king, they were righteous and obedient. If they had a bad king, they were idolaters. So I mean, it just goes to show that it is not in man that directs us.
Very true. We also talked about how these tribes seem to be a little different from Judah and Ephraim and Manasseh. And so here's where I brought in that point that Dave and I were talking about the other day. But I also see in here potentially, or you tell me whether you agree, I see in here a concern for future generations. And I think that's another key responsibility of leaders, is to develop the next generation of leaders. You know, in the business world, they call it succession planning. It's what we do as heads of our households. When we train our children, we train our sons and our daughters to grow up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, to be faithful to the Lord, to recognize, to love Him, and to serve Him, because we want them to be the next generation of faithful Christians and leaders as well. And so I do see potentially this concern for future generations showing up in Joshua and Caleb. All right, now we're into week 5. So we managed to finish up the last week's study. Chapter 19, we're going to go forward. And in verse 9, in verse 1 of chapter 19, they're ready to cast lots again. So they have already divided the land. We've seen at the end of chapter 18 describe the borders of the tribe of Benjamin. And now we're on to Simeon. And what did we notice when we talked about Simeon before? Simeon does have an inheritance, but it's not the same as the other tribes.
They're scattered in the midst.
They were in the midst of Judah. They had some territory, but it wasn't exact. It wasn't as defined, and it didn't wholly belong to them. Verses 2 through 8 describe what villages and cities that they inherited within Judah. And verse 9 tells us that their inheritance was taken out of Judah because Judah was actually too large, which I think is an interesting way to put that. Why again did Simeon not have their own inheritance?
Because in Genesis 49, their father said, I will scatter them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel.
Yep.
Because of the Dinah incident.
The Dinah incident. Yeah. So Simeon and Levi were the two sons of Jacob who were the avengers of the rape of Dinah. And so because of that, and because they were deceptive and they slaughtered the people, it's not the way that Jacob wanted it handled. He said, I will scatter you. So we know how Levi is being scattered. Simeon is being treated a little bit differently even than Levi. Do you think there's anything possibly we could see as significant in the description of Judah as being too large, or the description of Judah as encompassing or taking in Simeon? I might be stretching just a little bit, but I like to do that. So, go ahead.
Mine says it was more than they needed.
It was more than they needed. So there's this abundance in Judah. I think that's key. There's an abundance in Judah. And Judah, we know, is the tribe through which come David and then the Lord. There's an abundance in Judah. Judah takes in the people that don't have their own inheritance. I don't think that's a coincidence. Judah takes in the transgressor. I don't think that's a coincidence. Any thoughts on that? Yes, sir.
Well, it goes back to Genesis 49. It says that Judah is a lion's whelp. Judah gets the lion's share.
True.
It says that Judah as a lion, conquers his prey, and then it says until Shiloh comes.
Until Shiloh comes.
Judah, not the rest of the tribe.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that there is some foreshadowing of the grace that will be seen through Christ in this. All right, and then the next set of verses, if we can get the slide to change. Thank you. Verse 10, and it's going to go through, and we're going to kind of go through this pretty quickly because it's not all that interesting. But the third lot is cast, and it goes to Zebulun. And the next 6 verses or so describe Zebulun's borders and their territory. The fourth lot is cast, and it goes to Issachar and their borders and territory. And then the fifth lot to Asher and their borders and territory. And we see a theme there. And I want to get, so it was working so beautifully before. I'm just going to keep looking at Jerry. The sixth lot goes to Naphtali, or some say Naphtali, and their borders and territory. The seventh lot, in verse 40, the seventh lot goes to Dan. And then we see their borders and territory. But in verse 47, Dan does something remarkable or unusual. And what is that? Because in verse 47 it says, and the territory of the sons of Dan proceeded beyond them. So they have a territory assigned to them, and we'll see, I think, on a map again where that is in just a moment. They have a territory assigned to them, but it says their territory proceeded beyond them. What does it mean? They went and took more. Or actually, they went and took a different place. And why was that? Why did Dan not just stay where they were assigned to stay? It was because of the Philistines. It could be that. It also, we know their territory went all the way to the coast, which was the territory where there were still Philistines living, right? So it's just north of, I'm looking at the map I'm going to show you in a minute, it's just north of Gath and Ashdod and Ekron, which were some cities that we read about a few chapters ago, particularly Gath, because that's memorable. Who lived in Gath? Yeah, eventually Goliath's going to live in Gath, right? And so this is the territory where they had not driven out all the inhabitants. So they go up and they capture the city of Laish, or Lechem. Jerry, if you could bump us forward to the next slide, please. This map is, I think, kind of neat because it's topographical, but it also shows it's not looking directly north. North is kind of that way. But here is where Dan's territory was, in this coastal plain. The Philistines live over here. There's Gath, which we know is where there are Anakim, the sons of Anak, right, the giants, still living in Gath and Ashdod were a couple of the cities where they remained. Eventually, Goliath is going to come from there. So here's where Dan was assigned, but they couldn't really move in comfortably to all of it. So they go way up here, north of, there's the Sea of Galilee right there. They go up here into this mountain country and conquer this peaceful little city called Laish. And in verse 47 it says, for the sons of Dan went up and fought with Leshem and captured it. They struck it with the edge of the sword and possessed it and settled in it. And they called Leshem Dan, after the name of Dan, their father. This was the inheritance of the tribe of the sons of Dan, according to their families, these cities with their villages. So I think that's kind of interesting. I love maps. And this one I think is really neat because I'd shown you drawings before of what the layout of the land looked like, what the topography looks like. And I think this one really shows it nicely, where you can see how deep that Jordan River Valley is, how far down the Dead Sea is, how far down the Sea of Galilee is, and it's all surrounded by these hills. And you've got the coastal plain leading up through these mountains, and then you have the top of this mountain ridge, and then going down. And again, I always think of that when I see that, the places where it says they went up to Jerusalem, because you can see they always had to go up to go to Jerusalem. So that makes a lot of sense. All right, so the Dan tribe leaves the Philistine neighborhood is the label on the map. Unable to drive out the Philistines, they move north to the quiet town of Laish, which they can and do conquer. All right. So they go up, they conquer this city, and they take that over. And then verses 49 and 50, when they finished apportioning the land for inheritance by its borders, the sons of Israel gave an inheritance in their midst to Joshua, the son of Nun. In accordance with the command of the Lord, they gave him the city for which he asked, Timnath-Serah, in the hill country of Ephraim. So he built the city and settled in it. So after all the land is finally apportioned out, now Joshua, at the very end, gets his inheritance. These are the inheritances which Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun, the heads of the households of the tribes of the sons of Israel, distributed by lot in Shiloh before the Lord at the doorway of the tent of meeting. So they finished dividing the land. All right. So, I don't want to show you all the answers yet. Question number 1. The tribes had been without their homes, or without homes of their own, for over 400 years. But now they're all settled. Now they all have a place. It's finally done. Is this success from following God? That's one of the themes of our study here for this chapter. Success comes from following God. So for this whole month, that's been our kind of our sub-theme. Now they're settled. Now they have their inheritance. Is this evidence of success coming from following God? What do you think? Aaron?
I would say yes. I mean, they have the land that God promised them. There were definitely ups and downs where they didn't follow God and they, weren't successful. But in general, they have received the land. They obviously still have more work to do. So I guess it's kind of it's a continuation. It's a continual story.
Sure.
It's not just over. Now you're done.
Right. Yeah. I would say it is success from following God. But I think we need to be careful how we think of it. It's not their success. It's a success that they can enjoy. But it's not their success. They did not accomplish it by their own strength. Kind of to Aaron's point. They did not get there because they were so good, because they were so strong, because they were such good warriors. None of these men had ever picked up a sword in battle before. Maybe Joshua and Caleb, because they were there at the Exodus out of Egypt, and they were the only two left who saw that conflict, who saw what God did in Egypt, and who crossed the Red Sea. They were the only two individuals still alive who had seen that. No one else had. What we're dealing with here is basically one generation then and their offspring. So maybe 2 generations or so, probably leading on to 3. But the third generation would have been exceedingly young at this point. So we know they didn't do it by their own strength. They were a nation of wanderers. That's who they were. Inexperienced in battle, and only 2 elders who remain. The 2 old men that were left. Success here, I think, is absolutely a good word for what we're seeing. But it's not their accomplishment. It's God's doing. And it is a gift to them. We know they were only successful because God was with them, because the army of the Lord was fighting for them. And in fact, we saw a few chapters ago, Joshua himself even met face to face with the captain of the army of the Lord, or the commander of the army of the Lord. Success was a gift. And I think there's something in that for us. So in every sense, they followed God to the place of their inheritance. They literally followed him through the wilderness. They followed him through the Jordan River. They followed him around Jericho. They followed him to Gilgal. They followed him to Shiloh. He went before them wherever they went. Also just interesting to remember, I think, when Israel, Jacob, was alive, as well as his father and grandfather before him, anything they owned in that land, they had bought. They had purchased. So while they did own parts, little pieces within that land before Egypt, that was, and certainly that was given to them, by God. It was a blessing from God that they could do that, just like it is for us today. They did not possess all the land. They only lived in small little parts of it. Mr. White?
So all that's true, and we recognize looking at the way they took over the land that they were slow doing it. They had a lack of trust in God, and I'm sure God noticed that and felt that, because had they had the trust that they should have had, they would have gone in immediately and strongly at God's strength, not their strength, but God's strength, and taken the land in the first place.
I think you're right. And when we stop and think, too, and for us it's easy to miss this because we can read through it in a matter of minutes. But this took years. And if we think about our human nature, our resolve tends to peter off pretty quick when things are hard. And God fought for them, but they still had to act. They still had to go. They still had to fight. They still had to run. They still had to do this work. When you think about how long that takes over the course of years, your expectations and what you think of as worth it starts to change a little bit, and you start to be satisfied maybe with a little less, just because I don't know, we're pretty comfy just camping right here. Camping's all we've ever known, and our brothers and sisters kind of have some land, this might be all right. You can almost see how they might become tempted to back down in their zeal. Yes, ma'am.
Because I get kind of caught up in, this is a little bit boring reading through the allotments and stuff, but it's so detailed and it's so personal when you look at it. And then when you get to chapter 24 and he says, I gave, I delivered, I destroyed, I gave. It's just, if you underline every time he says, I did this for you, it's just such a beautiful story of God's gift and grace.
His providence. Absolutely. Yeah, and you also use the word grace, which we're going to get to in our next study. All right, I think rather than go forward into chapter 20, I'm going to stop right there, and we'll pick up with chapter 20 on Wednesday. Last word, Steve?
And I think the lesson for us is 1 Corinthians 10. These things happen to them so that we would see what unbelief is and we would learn from it. And Hebrews 4 says that we might not fall into the same example of disobedience
Yeah.
that we might enter his rest. This is happening to them so we will learn something from their mistakes, and I'm not sure how many times we do.
Yeah, no, I think you're very right. All right, thank you all for your good attention this morning.